to express his sorrow by firing his gun in the air several times before he moves to destroy Carrot's organization in the following scene. Now, Lil Zay is an abhorrent person, but how sad is it that a fellow human being has been so conditioned that their only mode of emotional expression is outrage and spite? From here on out, we're treated to ever more reprehensible behavior from Zay, as he first sexually assaults the woman he tried to dance with after beating her lover Ned to the ground, then moves on to his home with his gang in tow to execute him after mistakenly letting him live, then of course participating in a brutal gang war between his gang and the Carrot Knockout gang, which brought an untold amount of suffering to both innocents and criminals alike as a result of Zay and his underlings' instigation of and actions taken during the war. As could have been easily predicted, even if Zay hadn't fornicated with his amulet on, Lil Zay eventually meets his untimely end at the hands of the Runts, children following the same path he did. A bittersweet end, appropriate for a scion of the brutal world of the favelas. And at this end, who was Lil Zay? He was a child who was born in one of the most brutal environments one could imagine. Neglected from a young age and left to roam free in this hellscape, Lil Zay found his place amongst cutthroats and thieves, making a name for himself as a tough up-and-coming hood who could contend with the most notorious gangsters in his area. As he matured by bathing himself in the blood of others, Lil Zay became sociopathy incarnate, an unpredictable, violent, and wholly sadistic person who brought death and destruction to an untold number of people during the course of his short life. Was Lil Zay evil? Without a doubt, a person's actions are their own, and the willingness to cause suffering to others for your own personal gain is something that can't be excused. However, as we've discussed, that breeds men like Lil Zay due to the complicity and complacency of its inhabitants. It doesn't have to be this way though, and as time goes on and people yearn for change, they take action.
hatred for these individuals stored away in his memory to be used at a later date, and his behavior towards these people is racked with spite and snide hostility, which can devolve into violence when he's pushed too far. We have many examples of this throughout the film, and we first see this during his negotiations with the Sundays. Here, Daniel is on the losing side of a deal that he has deemed to be fruitful, and he becomes frantic, the veneer of a calm and collected businessman slowly fading as his nefarious intent is brought forward, and he becomes much more abrupt and dismissive in his speech patterns. What we get to see now is his impatience and panic mixed with rage when he views an opportunity to further his success slipping between his fingers. This is only a shadow of what's to come, and his rage manifests in increasing measure as the film progresses. From this point on, though, Daniel's rage is nearly always accompanied by the spite and snide hostility that I mentioned before, which, while tied to his rage, is more so tied to a superiority complex. Take, for example, the moment where Daniel refuses Eli's request to have Daniel introduce him and bless the well. Now, the reason that Daniel did this is obviously because he dislikes Eli, but there's more to it than that. Eli is, in a way, just like Daniel, but his motivations contrast and conflict with Daniel's. This makes it natural for the two of them to butt heads, but what rubs Daniel the wrong way in this moment is that Eli, someone who Daniel believes is both ridiculous and beneath him, deigned to tell Daniel what to do. And this is something that Daniel cannot abide from anyone, let alone this delusional, superstition-obsessed young man. Later in this scene, we get another moment of spite from Daniel when he displays disdain for Abel Sunday, who Daniel learned beats his daughter through his son, and makes it a point to call him out in front of his daughter, flashing his own power and stating that he'll be the one taking care of Mary from now on. We again see his rivalry and animosity towards Eli in the scene where he asks Daniel for the money that is owed to him. Here he abuses Eli for again attempting to tell Daniel what he needs to do. This is the same thing that happens with Tilford, as in their first meeting, Daniel perceives that Tilford is attempting to tell him how to run his family. Now, he might have been doing so to a certain extent, but not to the degree that Daniel believes he is, and the reaction Daniel has here is beyond excessive, especially for what is essentially a misunderstanding. Earlier, I mentioned that Daniel is able to empathize with the people he is negotiating with, and that's only partly true. As though Daniel is able to feign empathy for the purposes of conducting business, he has almost none when it comes down to it, and he is much more concerned with his own feelings rather than the feelings of others. His relationships suffer as a result of this, and Daniel finds himself without any true friends outside his own son, and for a time, his so-called brother. But as we know, both of these relationships end up crumbling. The one with his false brother is understandable, considering he had been deceiving and using him over the course of their relationship. However, that's no excuse for the way in which Daniel ended this relationship, and while he's completely justified in being angry with this man, that doesn't give him cause to murder him. As for his son, the devolution of their relationship happens because Daniel's narcissism gives him the distinction of being a narcissistic parent. We see that Daniel is clearly fond of his son, and also of Mary Sunday, but as we see towards the end of the film, the love he has for his son quickly evaporates when his son expresses his independence and his desire to go his own way, directly challenging the notion that the people Daniel is involved with and who have benefited from his success owe Daniel a debt of loyalty and gratitude. And anyone, family included, who falters on this debt is not worthy of his time or energy. A component of his superiority complex is Daniel's disdain and discomfort towards religion. We see this multiple times throughout the film, and it's clear that Daniel is a non-believer when it comes to anything spiritual, which isn't a bad thing by any means. But in Daniel's case, the reasoning for his non-belief runs deeper than theological or philosophical differences. I believe the reason for his atheism is the fact that Daniel is a self-made man, and due to the life of determination and self-reliance that he's led so far, he doesn't believe any sort of deity was present to help him along the way, and he doesn't appropriate his success and good fortune to any god, but rather to his own hard work and determination. We can only speculate on what Daniel's life was like before we met him in the opening scene of the film, but I think it's safe to say that through all the hardship he likely experienced in his life, he found no comfort in turning to God, and found no results when he turned to prayer, causing him to write off any notion of God or a higher power altogether, replacing it with utter faith in his own will to survive and succeed. All of these traits seem to indicate that Daniel either suffers from antisocial personality disorder, specifically sociopathy, or narcissistic personality disorder. However, he doesn't have all the symptoms of either, but he does display many of the behaviors that are present in a person with narcissistic personality disorder, more so than the symptoms that are prevalent within a sociopath. And those symptoms are his exaggerated sense of self-importance and exaggerated talents, as we see when he claims he's the only person capable of doing certain jobs, and how effective he is at completing them. His preoccupation with fantasies of his success, like when he enters into a trance-like state upon striking oil in Little Boston, where we see that he is so mesmerized with the gold he sees spewing forth from the earth, that for what seems to be an entire day, he stands watching this fountain of wealth like a predator, wholly unconcerned with the sorry state of his son lying deaf and broken right behind him. Then we have the way he monopolizes conversations and belittles people he views to be inferior to himself. His expectation of unquestioning compliance with his own expectations, as he expects with Eli, his son, and prospective business partners. The way he takes advantage of others to obtain what he wants. His inability or unwillingness to recognize the needs and feelings of others, as we see during his conversation with his son towards the end of the film. The envy he states to have for others. His dependence on alcohol. Significant interpersonal problems causing him to easily feel slighted. And secret feelings of shame, as we can see when he's questioned about his son, as well as feelings of vulnerability, which comes from his inherent loneliness that is apparent from his dependence on his relationship with both his son and falsified brother. I'm hesitant to claim that Daniel suffers from narcissistic personality disorder outright, and the reason for that is because people with this disorder aren't capable of feeling true guilt or remorse. But as we see a few times in the film, Daniel definitely is, particularly after he kills his false brother, when he admits to abandoning his son in the Church of the Third Revelation, and when he's reminiscing on the relationship he had with his son that has since been lost due to his own actions. These three moments hit Daniel in a similar way. The murder and loss of his false brother, coupled with the absence of his son in his life at that time, crushes Daniel in more ways than one. In the run-up to this moment, he realizes early in the day that this man is in truth not his brother. And throughout this day, he's torn on what to do about this revelation. On the one hand, you have a man who deceived him, but on the other is the fact that this man is Daniel's only friend in the world, and this conflict is tearing Daniel apart as the day goes on. This problem is eventually solved by something that Daniel frequently turns to for solutions: alcohol. A mixture of inebriation and rage enveloped Daniel, and only after he's buried this man's body and reads the diary of his actual brother does the magnitude of what he's been subjected to and what he's done hit him. The immense outpouring of grief we see here happens in part because Daniel is mourning the loss of a brother he never knew, and is so distraught over how thoroughly he was deceived and placated to a place of love and companionship that was nothing but a sham, a momentary solution to the overwhelming hatred he felt for nearly everyone around him. However, this grief also comes from the fact that he's selfish, and now that he's murdered his only friend, he feels utterly alone and is racked with despair and guilt over what he's done, realizing in this moment that though this man had deceived him, he still valued the relationship they had. I think the reason Daniel felt so attached to a brother figure, even a false one, can be understood by looking at three things he said during his competition speech. In that speech, he tells Henry that if Daniel has certain traits, they must be in Henry too. He then tells him that Henry joining him in his endeavors gave him a second breath in life, and then he goes on to say that he can't continue doing what he's doing alone. Now, Daniel has plenty of associates that he can rely on, but what Daniel sees in this brother is someone who might be just like him, someone that understands him, and will be able to support him in a way that others who don't share the same traits can. Finding this person was truly a second breath for Daniel. And though in actuality this false Henry didn't naturally contain the same traits as Daniel, he still formed a bond with him, and that bond was one of the few things outside of his own ambitions that Daniel truly valued. As for his abandonment of his son, he had already felt guilty for sending him away, and after Henry's death, his guilt over the murder amplifies the guilt he feels over abandoning his son. And even though Daniel is trying to power through his confession in the church and convince himself that he feels no remorse over his actions, we can see the pain that manifests on his face as he's shouting that he abandoned his son. Following the return of his son, Daniel is very hands-on and loving with him, holding him close to him as he realizes that he's the only thing in his life that has any real meaning. and is someone who can yet become the partner that he's always desired. Now, with all of this in mind, I think it's fair to say that Daniel has a borderline case of narcissistic personality disorder, as he certainly displays quite a lot of characteristics of this disorder. But the small amount of guilt and remorse he shows keeps him from having this disorder outright. I could be wrong, so if anybody has anything else to add to this overview, let me know down in the comments. Now, all of these traits within Daniel fuel the most detrimental aspect of his entire personality: his immense greed and desire to surpass all those around him, which is the cause of all the misfortune that occurs in his life, and what ultimately leads to him committing acts of evil. The consequences of this greed are presented to us in every endeavor that Daniel undertakes, as the good that occurs from his greed is always tempered by a tragic event that mars his success, whether it be personal or impersonal. We see this when he hastens to extract the silver from his mine, which causes him to break a leg, when the shoddy construction of his first derrick results in the death of another man, his negligent business practices that cause the death of yet another man, and then only a short time after, the deafening of his son, and in his later years, the shattered relationship he develops with his son after his ambitions have come to fruition. The way this greed affects Daniel is comparable to the behavior of an addict, where he experiences highs in the excitement and ecstasy he feels after his avaricious desires come to fruition, and intense lows in the highly negative fallout these desires cause in the destruction of either those around him, his own person, or the people he loves. And with this addiction comes a fatal flaw in Daniel that puts him in a perpetual cycle of elation and misery: his inability to understand that his greed is the direct cause of all the misfortune he experiences during his years as an oil man. Every drop of alcohol that enhances his emotions, every moment of recollection of past events, or understanding of the reality of his unfortunate circumstances, is shown to us in the way his features contort into a mournful and grief-stricken countenance, his demons haunting every memory that flits into his head. But with this pain comes no realization that it's he who is the cause of his misfortune, and not what he perceives as bad circumstance, or the people who he thinks undermine his efforts. It's this inability to accept the reality of his situation that causes Daniel to increasingly rely on alcohol, to the point where after his son comes back to him, his alcoholism has bled into his public life, and he proceeds to berate and humiliate Tilford in a show of liquor-fueled spite. By the time we find Daniel in 1927, we have a man whose successes have brought him great fortune, but this seclusion has hardly brought Daniel the happiness he so sought, and has instead reduced him to a depraved and emotionally volatile alcoholic. His encounter with his son shows us what unchecked greed can bring you. We see the eyes of a madman, behind which lies the selfishness we've come to expect from a narcissist like Daniel. And even here, with his son pouring his heart out to him, telling him that he loves him, and that he wishes to keep his relationship with him, a way to salvage the terrible conditions that Daniel has put himself in.
To defeat
right
them,
in front of
you
his
must
eyes.
awaken your
And he still
dragon
meets him
form.
with characteristic spite
Build and
and
equip the
anger.
multi-mission
2 years
mech
later,
and
in his
flip
castle
your
of his own
card
creation,
into dragon
his solemn
mode.
prison full of painful memories and dark stupors, we find for ourselves a Daniel who's
Go
silently
full
driven
ninja with
into the
new
hole
Lego
he's created
Ninjago
for
sets.
himself.
Each set
A
sold
disheveled
separately.
mess of a man, passed out in his own filth on the floor of his bowling alley. And now we see the truth of Daniel Plainview, that he is, like so many addicts, a slave to not only his greed, but to his own destructive narcissism. A man who is so consumed with his own self that his efforts have brought him to a point higher than where he started, but one much lower at the same time. Joy has been sapped from Daniel's life, and all that remains to him is a hunched, convulsive body filled with nothing but liquor, guilt, and broken memories. There is nothing left in Daniel to break the man he's become, and at this point, he's far beyond any sort of redemption, fully consumed by all the negatives that lay within his personality. And now, with Eli Sunday presenting himself to Daniel once again, the cruelest aspect of this abhorrent personality resurfaces: his spite. This spite is the only joy left to Daniel, and the elation we see Daniel experience during his mental torturing of Eli is likely the best he's felt in a long time. And this joy is, of course, accompanied by his anger, which has grown and grown during his years of isolation and alcoholism, bursting in this moment as he loses himself to his worst impulses and advances like a madman on a cowardly and defenseless Eli.
There seems to be a moment just after he's knocked Eli unconscious that Daniel considers what he's about to do and whether he should proceed. But this flicker of hesitation is quickly overridden by every ounce of pent-up emotion that Daniel has acquired over the last 18 years, all of which is unleashed upon Eli. He remarks to his butler at the end of this altercation that he's finished. And he is, in every sense of the word, as what is left for Daniel in this world he's created for himself. Not family, nor friends, nor anyone to compete with. Daniel has achieved everything he desired. He's succeeded. He's won. And all that he's become is his reward. This is who Daniel Plainview is. He's a man who held within him an admirable amount of self-determination and force of will, backed up by the desire to succeed in life and make something of himself. However, these traits would mean nothing when held within a narcissistic man whose focus was attuned solely on his own greed and his ambition to be first amongst his competitors, a victorious warrior standing atop a pile of his vanquished enemies. In his mad effort to build his own world, everything he held dear would crumble by his own hand, leading Daniel toward self-destruction, reducing him to nothing more than a hollow being filled with addiction, spite, and sorrow. A spiteful, avaricious, misanthropic, and narcissistic murderer, Daniel Plainview was a malignant tumor that fed off the lives of not only those around him, but his own soul as well, reducing him to the sorry state we find him in at the end of the film. And at this end, he has only himself to blame, as every terrible thing that Daniel has done, or that has been done to him, is the direct result of a man whose intentions and ambitions were sabotaged from the very beginning by nothing more than his own evil. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Daniel? Did I miss anything? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you liked this video and want to see more like it appearing in your feed, click the subscribe button to keep up on the latest episodes, and feel free to leave a like while you're at it. Thank you once again to all of my existing subscribers for your incredible support. If you'd like to support the channel further, consider signing up as a patron over on Patreon. You can find a link to Patreon down in the description. Thank you to everyone who signed up so far, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server to interact with myself and others in the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed in the description for occasional updates on the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon. Hello everyone, and welcome to the 38th episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring Walter White from Breaking Bad. This character will be the first anti-hero I've covered on this channel, and there's quite a lot about him that's sympathetic, especially in the earlier seasons of this show. Unlike a few other notable anti-heroes like Tony Soprano, whom you'll be getting an episode on very soon, Walter's actions and intentions from the beginning may be reprehensible, but they aren't exactly what you would call evil. Instead, this character is one who undergoes a gradual evolution over the course of this show, beginning as the very definition of your average middle American, and ending up as a cold-blooded and ruthless drug lord, who, while still remaining sympathetic as our protagonist, undoubtedly becomes the villain of his own story. This is going to be a rather lengthy introduction, but I think it's important that we touch on a few things before we continue. First is the topic of drugs. I'm not here to comment on the morality of using drugs, or whether or not they should be illegal, or what have you. I'm aware that plenty of legitimate businesses do terrible things in this world, and opinions on this subject are varied. But I think we can all agree that meth isn't exactly the greatest thing in the world, and whether legitimate or not, the world would probably be a much better place without it. I'd like to make it clear, we're examining Walt, and though meth is the catalyst for his downfall, it's his actions and the change in his character that turn Walt from a well-intentioned and relatively harmless individual
to nothing short of a power-hungry monster. The second thing that I'd like to touch on is crime, which can be a nuanced subject depending on the circumstances. For example, robbing a bank may not seem like it's too terrible a crime to commit. After all, as Spooge attempts to argue in this show, it's a victimless crime if nobody's hurt, as the banks are insured, so what's the harm? But there are so many other factors you need to consider in such a scenario. When you rob a bank, you're not just taking the money, but you're also putting the lives of civilians and officers of the law at risk, including the tellers, bankers, customers, and even pedestrians if there's a chase following the robbery, and on and on and on. The same could be said for murder that's committed as the result of, or in service to, criminal enterprises. Nobody joins the mafia and assumes it's going to be all daisies and roses. Everyone participating in these activities knows the rules of the game, so to speak, and in that way, some of the murders a person may commit while partaking in criminal activity may be more forgivable in a sense, as the only people you may be hurting are other criminals. However, as with robbing a bank, there are many facets to crime that cause horrible repercussions for people who aren't involved in these endeavors. Collateral damage, if you will, and the act of upholding a culture and business that actively deals in the harm or endangerment of individuals is something that shouldn't be taken lightly or encouraged. These anti-hero characters are ones we love to watch, and we're made to be sympathetic towards them, as we see them with their families and living ordinary lives not unlike the rest of us. However, that doesn't make their actions any less reprehensible, and an ordinary day-to-day life does not make up for the evil a person commits. I will be pointing out the crimes he commits in this series that are understandable and perhaps forgivable in a sense, but I wanted to make these two notions clear before proceeding with this video. I've thought a lot about how to structure this video. As though there's a lot of material to work with here, there's points in this series where it's rather redundant to cover every little thing that happens to Walt, or what Walt does, as these events don't change much about his overall character. As an example, there are big things in all of our lives that happen to us, or that we do, that don't totally alter our own personalities, and this is the same for Walt. With that said, this video will be divided into 4 sections corresponding to the 4 most important periods we're privy to, those being a brief section on Walt's backstory, the time before Walt begins working for Gus, Walt's time working for Gus, and after Gus's demise. Now without further ado, let's begin. As far as Walt's background is concerned, we only have a few things to go off of here. First is the fact that Walt has an estranged relationship with the only family we know of outside his immediate circle, his mom. And though she's mentioned a few times throughout the series, we never see or hear from her at all. During a scene between Walt and Walt Jr., Walt talks about his dad, who's been dead since he was 6 years old, and how his last memories of the man are ones of pain and heartbreak, as all he can remember of his dad is how he looked and sounded as he lay dying on his deathbed. His relationship with his mom is telling of something that we'll be discussing quite often throughout this video, and that's the fact that Walt tends to avoid uncomfortable emotional and familial scenarios rather than address them head on, as whenever he speaks of his mom, he does so in a way that indicates that she's more of an annoyance in his life more than anything. Next, we have Walt's education and career prior to becoming a teacher. During his time as a student, he earned an award for his research into X-ray crystallography, which he was given for his contribution to research that earned the Nobel Prize. I'm going to highlight something here that I won't be bringing up later on in this video, and that's the fact that Walt is clearly a genius, and not just in chemistry, but in mechanics, mathematics, and planning. He has a complex mind that is well suited to problem solving, and his ingenuity in nearly all of his endeavors is what brings about much of his success throughout this series. After graduating, he went on to found Gray Matter Technologies with Elliot, where he met Gretchen and developed a relationship with her, and eventually becoming engaged to her. After meeting her family during a 4th of July weekend, Walt suddenly, and without warning, cut off his relationship with Gretchen and sold his stake in Gray Matter, completely severing his ties with both Elliot and Gretchen. We aren't given much insight into this incident in the show, but in 2016, Vince Gilligan stated in an interview that the reason Walt left Gretchen was due to the wealth of her family and the inferiority he felt at this revelation, knowing that if he went on to marry her, he would forever live in the shadow of their wealth, a notion that Walt's pride couldn't take. Even though it's obviously his own fault that Walt lost out on the success of Gray Matter, he he still blames Elliot and Gretchen for his failures, and by the time of the pilot, his relationship with them has become strained. Now, this aspect of Walt that caused him to sever his ties with them is something that we find ourselves coming in contact with quite often during this series. I can't say where this pride came from, as again, we have little to go off of in the way of a background for Walt, especially where his childhood is concerned, but it is perhaps the most detrimental aspect of Walt. And his pride is something I'll be mentioning frequently as we move forward. After leaving Elliot and Gretchen behind, Walt went on to work in various research labs over the years, eventually meeting Skylar at a diner he frequented on his lunch hour, where she worked as a hostess. Soon after, they would marry, and Skylar would become pregnant with Walter Jr., at which time they ventured into purchasing their first home in anticipation of the new baby. In this scene, Walt tells Skylar that they need to find a bigger house because they'll be having more children in the future. And when she responds that it's not within their budget, Walt wonders why they shouldn't take risks and attempt to live outside of their means, as they have nowhere to go but up. For reasons unknown to us, this is decidedly not the case, as Walt ends up teaching at a high school, leaving them living at a subsistence level at their new home, a level which is barely enough to keep them afloat, let alone comfortable, in their new lives as a married couple. Now, this isn't exactly a lot of information to go off of, but aside from showing us a bit of his pride and the way he handles his emotions and familial relations, this backstory does tell us two key things about Walt that are inherent to his character. The fact that he's always dreamt of bigger things, and that he once had a promising career and future that was stripped from him, partially due to his own shortcomings and for reasons unknown. With this information, we can move on to who Walt is at the beginning of this series up until the time he begins working for Gus Fring. Now, this backstory may be small, but it does give us great insight into what we're given at the very beginning of the show. A man who's now past his prime, one who's fallen from greatness, and reduced to teaching high school chemistry. To add further insult to what he likely perceives as an already underwhelming career, he's forced to make ends meet working at a car wash. Add these two depressing factors into your average, run-of-the-mill middle America lifestyle, with a boring marriage as an addition, and you have the perfect recipe for a deeply unsatisfied man. In these early stages, he's rather meek and mild-mannered, enforcing the rules of his class with a light touch, and he shies away from the more abrasive conversations that men like Hank are partial to. And he seems to be one who acquiesces to the wishes of his wife, being the one who brings in the money, but not the one who's making any of the decisions in the household, giving us the impression that he's become beaten down and reduced to a shadow of the promising man he had once been. It's no wonder then that once he's given a diagnosis of lung cancer, that he suddenly gains perspective into his bland, milquetoast life and all that it's amounted to. As we know, he doesn't tell his wife about his diagnosis, acting much the same way as he does with his mom, preferring to avoid whatever headache he would receive as a result of revealing these truths or engaging in a deeper way with his family, putting off this revelation until the last minute. As we see quite often throughout the series, he's the kind of man who prefers silence over emotional engagement, preferring to live as more of a stoic than a person who talks openly about their feelings. Now, I assume that before this point in his life, he'd essentially resigned himself to working his two jobs, and just trying to get by with what little he can. I'm sure any of us can imagine what a virtual death sentence would do to our perspective on our own lives. Perhaps you would travel the world, or live out your fantasies with the time you have left. For Walter, it brings nothing more than an added layer of misery and despair. As what options does a man with a family he's barely providing for now have? With a baby on the way, a child still in high school, and a mortgage, who's going to provide when he's gone? That's not to say he has no options at all, as there are always options for a person, even if they might be grim. But it's easy to understand why Walt turns to an alternate and highly dangerous method of making money once he's given his diagnosis. Not only that, but why his attitude has started to adjust towards a nothing matters anymore, so why not mentality. This is the larval stage of the Walter White we come to know as time goes on. He's a bit gruff, abrasive, and has a temper that manifests with an overall renewed vigor and confidence after his diagnosis. But otherwise, he's an unremarkable man with a remarkable set of talents who's only looking to provide security and safety for his family after he's gone. He isn't doing this for any overly ambitious reasons. His intentions at this point are as pure as they can be when indulging in the manufacture of narcotics. Here, he isn't proud of what he's doing by any means, especially after he thinks he's murdered both Emilio and Crazy 8, which he feels enormously guilty for, even though it was done in self-defense. He's incredibly naive in regard to anything to do with the criminal lifestyle, and sees thugs like Crazy 8 as average, rational human beings, a notion that ultimately leads to him almost surrendering his life to Crazy 8 for a second time after he attempts to treat him with respect and understanding. Even when he's trying to assert himself towards his wife, it's almost innocent in the way that he tells her to back off, as he never raises his voice, and politely tells her, with some swearing, to get off his back. As I mentioned earlier, one thing Walt has in abundance is pride, a deep-seated, detrimental, bottomless well of pride. We see a small amount of his pride manifest when Hank tells him that he'll take care of his family no matter what happens, but it really shines through for the first time when he shoots down Elliot's job offer. I mentioned before that a person always has options when it comes to an illness, and those options can be quite grim. Here, though, is a 1 in a million opportunity, a friend who is willing to provide you with a well-paying job, great health insurance, and even the money for your treatment, an offer you'd honestly be quite stupid to turn down. There is, of course, what happened between the three of them in the past, and Walt's desire not to go through treatment at all, which he explains quite well during his intervention, where he states his desire to have a choice in the matter of his own destiny, the ability to decide for himself how he will suffer, and how he will live out his last days on Earth. But even so, if you're willing to commit crimes to provide for your family, you think you might be a bit more willing to bite the bullet and let old wounds heal in order to provide for them in a much more safe and secure way. Not Walt, not a man who's got such an inflated ego, an overtly macho sense of pride, that even after he's committed 2 murders, which understandably shook him to his core, he still chooses to resort to manufacturing drugs, just so he can have the satisfaction of knowing he was capable of providing for himself and his family without outside help. And this is how he transitions into the monster he eventually becomes, with baby steps, as Walt is now actively choosing to refuse legitimate help from a friend, and is instead lying to his family, endangering them and himself, and pursuing monetary gain through illegal activity, all to satisfy his own ego. This is only the beginning, and the real transformation of Walter White doesn't occur until after Jesse is beaten up by Tuco, a matter that he takes both on a personal and professional level. Even so, his intentions are still selfless, even if his pursuit of his goals is selfish, and his actions aren't too terrible as of yet, and he's still fairly afraid of the ramifications of being a criminal, as we see when he's visibly shaken up after Tuco murders Nodos. Even his plot to murder Tuco isn't exactly malicious, as this is in self-defense more than anything. Outside of his criminal activities, his lies to his family are his biggest transgressions at this time in his life. His relationship with his wife grows increasingly strained as he tries to overcompensate for his supposed fugue state and skirt around her constant absences that he has no right to argue over. His attempts at avoiding conflict with his wife have only resulted in more trouble for Walter, as at this point, he's tried to hide his cancer, his relationship with Jesse, and his whereabouts in order to lessen the load he might have to bear if these truths were revealed. However, all these lies have brought him nothing more than exactly what he was trying to avoid, which is almost always the result you get from constant lies. Though he's grown more brazen after the death of Tuco, Walt at this time is still very much hesitant to become a full-fledged criminal, shying away from Jesse's suggestion of becoming a distributor. However, once the money starts coming in, his attitude changes. And it changes even more when his kick is light. In one moment, he's hesitant about becoming a distributor, and in the next, he's suggesting violence after Skinny Pete is ripped off. And not just violence, but potentially murder. He does tell Jesse after the fact that he only meant for him to intimidate the people who stole from him. But the way he suggested it to Jesse in the first place definitely gave off the impression that he meant otherwise. His show of force toward Tuco may have been the beginning of his descent into darkness. But the suggestion is one that accelerates this descent, as this is Walt's first actual order he gives that is of a more malicious nature. This is still in self-defense in a way, as he's attempting to protect his interests in this business, but it's still one hell of a step to take. Walter at this point is well on the way to morphing from the average, middle American doormat husband to a ruthless and assertive man who takes what he wants and says whatever he likes. Our first real glimpse of his enhanced vigor outside of his increased libido is his encounter with Gretchen after she visits his home, where he becomes abrasive and withdrawn, arguing with Gretchen about the role she has in his life and how little she deserves any kind of explanation from Walt on the matter, ending this conversation by spitting verbal venom at her as he tells her off. And in the following episode, he has an exchange with a student in much the same way, which is an emerging personality that is in stark contrast to the man we met at the beginning of this series. As I said before, he was hesitant about becoming a distributor, but his hesitations become non-existent once he realizes that the entire city of Albuquerque fears Jesse after word gets out that he's the one who supposedly killed Spooge. Though we've seen a bit of this already, this is a great example of Walt being a man who capitalizes on any potential opportunity he sees. And this is a huge one that will increase his capacity to obtain the amount of money he needs before he dies, which, at this time, is still his primary goal. Something that seems minor in how quickly the moment comes and goes is Walter's willingness to have Badger killed in prison after his arrest, giving Jesse a look as if to say that it's what he thinks they should do after Saul suggests it. Another indicator that Walt is beginning to see the world in a much different way, and his apprehension towards murder is beginning to diminish. Soon after, Walt finds out he won't be dying as soon as he had hoped, which is an odd thing to hope for, but it makes sense when you consider if he does live, he'll have to live with the ramifications of what he's done, and there's no way out now. So, in an attempt to make up for what he sees as the inevitable revelation of his illegal activities, he begins fixing up his house and trying to distract himself from the fact that he may very well have ruined a life he has to live now, which is also another way for Walt to give his life some purpose now that his life is going to go back to being painfully mundane, though this renewed interest in his house doesn't last for long. Once he spies someone at a hardware store attempting to set up their own meth lab, Walter's greatest weakness kicks in once again. His pride which won't allow people in his town to encroach on what he believes is his, muddying up the market with their inferior product. This is even more apparent later on, when Walt is unwilling to launder his money in a way that would make it seem like the money came from luck, or a benefactor. Instead, he needs the validation that his hard work will be recognized, that his family will know that he was the one who provided for their future, which is another reason he would have liked to die, as he wouldn't have been around to suffer the consequences of his family's scorn over how he made his money. After Combo is murdered, he even starts talking about setting up a bigger organization, commenting that they need to employ foot soldiers and get payback for Combo's murder, showing us that Walter is seriously considering stepping up to become a drug lord, even if he may still be hesitant at the prospect at the moment, seeing as how he would much rather prefer to get set up with Saul's potential distributor than go it on his own, even after his negative experience with Tuco. Now, before he had this run-in at the hardware store, one thing you really couldn't say about Walt is that he was greedy, as everything he was doing was budgeted in a way to provide for his family at a bare minimum level, ensuring that they would have their bills paid and that his children went to college. But he was never working to provide for them more than what they had now. But now, his perspective is changing. He's seeing now that if he doesn't die, he has to go back to a life he was miserable living, with a house that's crumbling beneath his feet, and a world where luxuries are few and far between. As I mentioned in his backstory, Walt has always wanted a bigger life, and now that he's going to be amongst the living, he's no longer in a hurry to provide what he can to his family in the event of his demise. Now he's wondering what heights he could reach, and to what degree he could improve the lives of his family members, and himself. However, there's something standing in the way of his expansion into the drug trade, and that's Jesse's increasing unreliability. Though Walt has his moments where his emotions get the better of him during his endeavors, Jesse is far more susceptible to the horrors of their trade, which we've seen a number of times already, namely after the murders of Emilio, Crazy 8, No-Dose, Tuco, Spooge, and Combo, all of which wear Jesse down to the point that after Combo, a close friend of his, is murdered, he once again resorts to using drugs to deal with his sorrow, and now that he has a partner who's participating in this behavior with him, he's digging himself into an even deeper hole. This increased drug use jeopardizes the deal with Gus, and after Walt saves the deal, it almost falls through once again because Jesse is so out of his mind on heroin, he can barely form a coherent sentence. This is as good a time as any to talk about Walt's and Jesse's relationship during this period, which has evolved significantly over time. Where once Walt viewed Jesse as nothing more than a worthless junkie who was his ticket to a mass amount of cash, he has now taken on sort of a fatherly role for Jesse, actively trying to get Jesse to better himself and improve their business. There's a flashback in El Camino that supports this idea, where Walt is actively concerned with Jesse's future, attempting to nudge him in the direction of going to college, which shows us that he undeniably cares for Jesse in a much bigger way outside their business dealings. His attitude towards Jesse is still certainly quite selfish, in that he's trying to improve his life in order to make their business run more smoothly. But there's another component I mentioned that we have to consider here: the fact that Walt views Jesse as his son, and more importantly, a son who can carry on his legacy when he's gone. Walt has Walter Jr., and there's no reason he won't succeed in his own right, but he's never going to follow in Walt's footsteps. And due to his condition, he wouldn't be able to, even if he were to try. Jesse, however, is perfectly capable of filling this role, and by the time Jesse is attempting to sever their relationship in favor of his relationship with Jane, Walt has come to care for Jesse almost as much as a member of his own family. And his reasons for trying to keep him involved in this business are always underscored by this notion. This is what brings Walt to a situation where he commits his first true act of evil, letting Jane die. This act is, in a way, done to improve Jesse's life, but is on the whole an incredibly selfish act. There's a lot of things that could be said about Walt letting Jane die. For example, it could be argued that she had done this to herself, as Walter wasn't the one who put the needle in her arm. And this could even be seen as self-defense in a way, as she was threatening to blackmail him, and he had no real way of knowing whether or not she would keep her mouth shut. However, I believe this scene, and the consequences of his actions following this scene, are meant to highlight the fact that the selfish and terrible actions a person takes inevitably have an effect on other people. Walter didn't just let Jane die, he let Donald's daughter die, and Jesse's lover. And due to his actions, 167 people who otherwise wouldn't have, had Donald been in the right state of mind. Maybe Jane would have never gotten better. Maybe her actions would have resulted in the downfall of Jesse, or any number of unfortunate possibilities. Or she and Jesse could have turned their lives around and lived happily ever after in New Zealand. But either way, none of who Jane is, or was, is Walt's decision to make. We can only do what we are capable of doing. We can try and help people, but ultimately their decisions are their decisions, and they must suffer the consequences of their decisions. But if we can do something, if we can save someone's life, it's more than likely that we should, as we don't know how a person's life is going to play out until it does. Now, there are exceptions to this, of course. If a post-trial Ted Bundy were drowning, I doubt many of us would throw him a life preserver. But all of the events leading up to Jane's death wouldn't have occurred had Walt not gotten involved in the manufacturing of meth in the first place. All of what I've said about Jane can apply to a number of different things that happen in this story. But the point here is that one terrible decision, no matter how big or how small, can ultimately result in an untold amount of consequences. There's going to be some conflicting views on this issue, I'm sure, but in essence, I believe this is what this scene was trying to convey. And though we may be sympathetic to Walter and his reasonings for letting Jane die, at the end of the day, I think we still need to recognize that this was the wrong thing to do, even if it hadn't resulted in all the deaths that followed. This serves to bring Walter closer to Jesse, either out of guilt or something else. And it also helps Jesse in that it gets him to go to rehab, but the ramifications of this single act are horrifying to say the least. And the moment those two planes crash above Albuquerque serve as a grand crescendo to end this chapter in Walt's life. A chapter that's marked by the revelation of his lies as Skylar dug deeper into his actions, depriving Walt of his family, the very family he had begun this endeavor for in the first place. At this time, we have a Walter whose grand intentions have been muddied by his own lies and actions, and the unfortunately fortunate news of his life expectancy being extended has brought him to a point where his pride has simultaneously brought him much higher than he had been when he started out, but much lower at the same time. And now, we follow Walt into the next chapter of his life, his time working for Gus Fring. After a back-and-forth struggle with his wife for their marriage, Skylar's infidelity, and an unknown to him near-death experience at the hands of the twins, Walt finds himself not so comfortably back at home, and in a position of hard pride once again. Jesse has decided to go his own way and cook meth without Walt, which infuriates Walt's sense of pride, as he believes and knows he's the best, and anyone who attempts to mimic his product is tarnishing his legacy. After separating from Jesse, he's subject to a ploy from his soon-to-be employer, Gus Fring, who plays both of them against each other, goading Walt into cooking meth again. To tantalize him further, he hangs a carrot in front of his face in the form of a lab, a well-kept, state-of-the-art chemical laboratory, one that Walt has been pining to work in for many, many years. Gus hints at an aspect of Walter here that we haven't touched on yet, that's bolstered by his desire to show himself as a man who can take care of his family, a component of his ego and his pride that serves as a great harm to Walter. Perhaps because of his own father's death, Walter feels that he should provide for his family to the best of his abilities, give them what he never had, what his own father was unable to give him. It could be the way he lived his life up to this moment, a life where he's had to sit on the sidelines and watch other, greater men succeed,
and even deign to offer their help in providing for his family. Walt is trying to prove himself to the world, and to himself, that he can be the great man he feels he was destined to be, that his former glory is not gone and over, but alive and well, and that he can be the man who will bring his family to new heights of prosperity, something that the keenly astute Gus strikes at perfectly. Throughout this time, Walter remains quite devoted and motivated by his family, or so it seems. He's actively seeking more wealth, this time to the tune of $3 million offered to him by Gus Fring, though as I said, at this time, he still thinks he's doing what he's doing for the benefit of his family, even if his actions have led to the shooting of his brother-in-law by Tuco's cousins. This still ends up helping Walt in a way, as he's able to secure an annual contract with Gus after this event. But he's still, even now, quite hesitant about his role in the criminal world, and attempts to end his life by running his car into a semi before things get even more out of hand. This hesitation is more than just his apprehension towards becoming a criminal. It's the fact that he feels his life is spiraling out of control. He feels as if the walls are closing in on him, as Skylar now has the idea, and rightfully so, that Walt is somehow responsible for Hank's shooting. And though he has this nice new job doing what he loves, he's alone and away from his family. His life's meaning now rendered nearly obsolete. He's still providing for his family like he wanted to, but Gus's words of a man bearing the burden no matter the cost only partially resonated with Walter, as he has a deep-seated desire to not just provide, but to be recognized and loved. And now that he's been banished from his own home to wallow in his own misgivings, his mental state is beginning to falter. Not only that, but there's the fact that his position in this business is far from secure, as he knows if they can get to Hank, they can definitely get to him. His feelings during this time are explained to us when he has this strange mental breakdown during the fly sequence, where he tells Jesse that he had the perfect time to die, the perfect situation where he could become the hero his family needed. And now it's gone, and rather than the martyred hero, he's the ostracized villain. To bolster the idea that Walt is indeed becoming the villain is his murder of the two men who shot Tomas. No one is rooting for these guys, that's for sure. And it's not necessarily the act of murdering these men that's shocking, but the way in which Walter does so, particularly how he guns down the one left living after he runs them over with his car. Here, Walt murders this man with no hesitation whatsoever, an act he does about as casually as you would swat a fly. This shows us that whatever reservations Walt had about murdering people earlier on in this series is gone, and he's now more than comfortable murdering someone if he deems it to be the right thing to do. This is evident with how he handles his inevitable death after this event when he plots to murder Gale, as even though after the fact, he acknowledges that Gale didn't deserve to die, he would in no way value Gale's life over his own, and if he had to have Gale killed again, he would do so in order to save his own life. These last three murders are definitely sympathetic and understandable, as if a child were murdered, someone we cared about were in harm's way, and our lives were in danger. I imagine many of us would react in a similar fashion to Walt. Even though Walt's reasons for taking these actions are understandable, they all fall under the category of being unnecessary, as well as being terrible stepping stones in Walt's journey towards evil. As again, Tomas may have never gotten shot, and Gale wouldn't have needed to be murdered had Walt not got involved in this business. After the murder of Gale and Victor, Walt is left between a rock and a hard place, as a man like Walt would rather die than lay down and let Gus have his way, as he already proved with his murder of Gale. Throughout the ensuing saga to get the better of Gus, Walt honestly changes very little. There's a gradual shift in the dynamic of his marriage as Skylar both comes to accept and revile Walt, and there are several different times where he attempts to manipulate Jesse into doing things that he needs him to do. But though many different things obviously occurred during this time, Walt remains virtually the same up until episode 9 of season 4, where the real change starts to happen. After his fight with Jesse, after he realizes that he's losing this battle with Gus, and that he's losing Jesse, his proverbial son, Walter, in an emotional breakdown with Walter Jr., realizes that he's made not just one mistake, but several, and they're catching up to him as he sits there waiting for the seconds to pass him by. This is a rare moment of humility for Walter. His pride has brought him to the lowest point he's been at since Gus had him watch Victor bleed to death. And this is only the beginning. And once Jesse has come back from Mexico, Walter is finished, and he panics like it's the end of the world, which it essentially is. Thus begins a mad dash to save his own life, where Walt poisons a child to regain the trust of Jesse, puts the life of one of his neighbors in danger when he's attempting to get into his home, and blows up a nursing home, 3 acts which show us that Walt has now gone so far off the deep end that he's very much willing to sacrifice the lives of innocents to save his own skin. I know the bombing of the nursing home didn't directly affect any innocents, but it very well could have. And the fact that he was willing to even entertain such an idea is telling of Walt's increasing lack of morality. This saga ends in the death of Gus, Tyrus, Hector Salamanca, and 2 unnamed thugs at the lab. And although all these people are players of the same game Walt is engaged in, his plot to murder Gus is rife with terrible actions that highlight the intense selfishness of Walter White. During his time working for Gus, we see a man who's comfortable with his new place in this illicit industry, one who's growing increasingly estranged from his wife and immersed in a false reality of lies and manipulation. But his actions during this period give us insight into what's been forming inside Walter White. A monster who has little to no care for anyone other than himself, no matter how hard he tries to pretend otherwise. And with that, we move on to the final chapter in Walter's life, his time as the new lord of the meth business. Here is where Walter transforms from a man teetering on the edge of noble intent and criminality to completely toppling over into the territory of ruthless drug lord. Walt's attitude had already begun to change, which we had seen previously in the famous "I am the one who knocks" speech to Skylar. But now his pride and ego have inflated to such a high degree that he's become almost unrecognizable from the man he once was. Sure, he's still Walt, but it's as if he's attempted to absorb Gus into his own personality following his demise, taking up his mantle as kingpin of the meth business, and acting as if he's now suddenly the man of the hour, the boss who shouldn't be questioned. He proposes a partnership with Jesse and Mike, but in reality, he now sees himself as the head of this operation, and though he acquiesces to their suggestions and advice on occasion, namely Mike's, he still feels like he's the man who's in control and the one making the decisions. Though he's blissfully unaware of what he's done to Skylar at the start of this season, acting as if the world has been righted and nothing at all is wrong anymore, he soon realizes that he's damaged his wife in a way that leaves her terrified of him and the business he's engaged in, leaving her feeling like a helpless hostage in the world of Walter White. This doesn't matter to Walt though, as when Skylar attempts to one-up him and tell him that she's basically going to make his life a living hell until he renounces his business, or dies, Walt pushes her into a corner and shows her that she, like those around him, are powerless in the face of the indomitable will of Heisenberg. I haven't talked about this yet, but before, when Walt would engage in criminal behavior, he would don his signature pork pie hat, an indication that Walt was leaving behind the meek and mild-mannered chemistry teacher known as Walter White, and becoming Heisenberg, the merciless and brutal drug baron, a sort of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde dynamic. Now, Walter no longer has any need for the hat, as he's become so enmeshed between these two personalities that they have melded together to become one person. We do see him don the hat a few times throughout this season, but when he does, it's arbitrary at best. However, there are a few more instances in this season where Walter is ashamed of what he does when giving in fully to this Heisenberg alter ego, which we'll be covering shortly. Walter is now totally content, in fact more than content, with the new life he's living. He's finally on top, reaching the heights he's always strived for, and he is now the ultimate decider of his destiny, and the destinies of those around him. Walt's attitude change here is best explained when he's having a conversation with Jesse at his home after the murder of Drew Sharp, where they discuss the opportunity Walt is given to get out of the meth business for a sizable sum of $5 million. Here he explains to Jesse how he missed out on the success of Gray Matter by selling his share in the company too early. He envisions the same thing happening if he sells out too early in this business, and more important than that, he tells Jesse that he's in the empire business, not the meth business. This shows us another aspect of Walter's pride and ego, the fact that he's in a way attempting to compete with his former friends and the people who he believes robbed him of what's owed to him, and his children. By expanding his interests in the meth business, he not only provides for his family, but achieves greatness on par with Elliot and Gretchen, an achievement that he can be satisfied with, and one that he can take with him happily to the grave. However, that's not the only component to this desire to create an empire, as Walt explains to Jesse that he now has nothing left in his life, as his wife hates him, his kids are out of the home, and outside of the meth business, he would be nothing but a pitiful car wash owner. It's these ideas that cause Walt to ignore things that he would have once been outraged over, like the murder of Drew Sharp, which the Walter White that we encountered at the beginning of this story certainly wouldn't have stood for. It's also what causes this man to burn through restraints in an excruciatingly painful way, just so he can stop a deal Mike has orchestrated to sell their methylamine, like a rat gnawing through its cage. If Walt's immense amount of self-harming pride wasn't evident enough already, we get a glimpse into how all-consuming it is when Mike calls him out on it during their confrontation at the end of episode 7. Here, Walt doesn't kill Mike because of any rational reason. He does so because Mike has shoved a knife into the very center of what makes Walt the monster that he is. And as I've said before, Walt isn't a man who's good with confronting emotional or personal truths. This prodding causes Walt to go into a mad rage that ends in the death of Mike, an event that he's immediately remorseful for once the adrenaline wears off. One of those moments of humility and shame that managed to permeate his new status as a near-ruthless drug lord. However, this doesn't last for long, as soon after Mike's demise, he enacts a plan to murder the 10 former members of Gus's crew that's nothing short of brilliant, as having them all murdered within a 2-minute window to avoid the others being placed in protective custody following the murder of one is a plan worthy of one who could be called a criminal mastermind. If we weren't convinced of how far down the rabbit hole Walt had really gone, this shows us that he's very much living up to being the brutal kingpin he aspires to be. Before this event, but following Mike's death, we see once again a low in his relationship with Jesse. Their relationship has risen and fallen throughout the series. And after Jesse decides to go his own way, Walt drops all of his supposed care for Jesse and starts being petty towards him, making sure that whenever Jesse is involved in any of his ongoing business, he makes a point to belittle him, reminding him that he's out and he has no say in anything. This is Walt's pride taking over once again, as though he cares for Jesse and views him as a son, as I said earlier. His care for the man is superseded by his own selfish desire to mold Jesse into the vessel that will carry on his legacy once he dies. After all, what good